I love you. Hear me? Do you hear me? I love you.
Then why do you hold me like an enemy?
Our world is an inversion of what it should be. Instead of following the natural human impulse to cultivate this planet like a garden, capitalism is raping Mother Nature and turning her every ecosystem to shit. Industrial agriculture has thoroughly poisoned our farmlands and waterways. Every living thing now accumulates potentially cancer-causing levels of glyphosate. Thanks to Monsanto, there's no escaping it. Our heedless use of plastic is polluting our oceans and disrupting our endocrine systems. Chemicals that make plastics more flexible, called phthalates, also leach into human bodies, making men sterile while shrinking their genitals. At the current rate of fertility collapse, most men won't be able to produce sperm by 2045.
Sperm counts in the Western world could reach dangerously low levels.
Our endless wars, no matter how the war profiteers and mockingbird media journalists justify them, are yet another sure sign that we live in a destructive, criminal world that's largely owned and operated by psychopaths. Most of us, outside the predator class, seem to abide by a hazy set of ethical principles, like be a good neighbor. But we also tend to be lazy and willfully obtuse about how we're colluding in our own doom. We want to forget about our own small crimes or sins against nature and just have a nice life. But we can't say we're against war profiteering if we own stock in Raytheon or Lockheed Martin. We can't say we're against poisonous agricultural practices if we're buying synthetic, GMO-laden mystery meat from Whole Foods. We all have a tendency to spout hypocritical rationalizations as if they can excuse our civic disengagement and lack of critical thinking. But if men won't rise up, collectively, to save their own penises, then what will it take to get us to change our current trajectory towards self-obliteration? Are we willing to allow a bunch of privacy-invading, eugenics-obsessed technocrats and oligarchs to bifurcate the human species into a dominant ruling class and a sterile, obedient underclass of masked and locked-down debt serfs? Will we let ourselves be herded into smart cities, where we'll be perpetually monitored and geofenced in by a global biosecurity state? That's no longer science fiction. It's clearly what the predator class is aiming for, a neo-feudal, techno-fascist slave system that will commodify people and trade them, like coffee or soybeans, in human capital bond markets, where even genocide, perhaps especially genocide, can turn a profit for the bankers and hedge funds that issue those bonds and then bet against them. This amounts to a war against most of humanity, and we won't be able to win that war if we don't understand the strategies of the other side. From a spiritual perspective, I'm not even sure if winning is entirely the point. Some people refuse to give in to tyranny, no matter what the cost, because they're sovereign individuals who are free by divine authority. They can take cold comfort from Rilke's words in The Man Watching. Winning does not tempt that man. This is how he grows. By being defeated decisively by constantly greater beings. Alison McDowell had something to say about the looming threat of technofascism during the worldwide freedom rally held at New York City's Union Square on March 20th.
Yes, my name is Alison McDowell, and if you are familiar with my work, you can find more about it at my blog, rentsinthegears.com, and I have a YouTube channel under my name. I'm kind of a fire hose, so if it doesn't make sense, it's important, stick with it, you'll get it eventually, alright? We knew the age of surveillance capitalism was dawning, but none of us anticipated this trigger event that turned our world upside down a year ago March. We must work to transmute this profanity that has descended upon us into something sacred, a sacred, non-cybernetic future. That future is not one where we live in a planetary computer or as characters in a virtual reality simulation. That world is not a world of bar-coded life. That world is not one that is fueled by cyborg avatar capitalism. We see this choice. It is a choice between two paths, one green, one scorched. And we know that the choice we make, the stand we take today and every day moving forward will determine not just the course of our lives, but the lives of all other beings on this planet and those not yet born. Michael Bloomberg, Goldman Sachs, Stanley Druckenmiller, Tal Tudor Jones, and the rest of the hedge fund crowd have no right to predictively profile us, put us on social prescribing self-improvement pathways, track our compliance with wearable technology, and use that data to run pay-for-success deals profiting off social misery. Who do they think they are to impose digital identities like these health passes and package us as asset-backed securities? Tranches of impact investments, human capital data commodities, to be tracked as domesticated livestock through a spatial web of mixed reality. The Davos elite have no right to foreclose the futures of children. Their soulless smartness is no match for our symphonies, our songs, our dance, our poetry, our cuisine, our street art, laughing children, and warm embraces. Our destinies are too magnificent to fit on any puny blockchain ledger.
First it was endless war, now they want endless war on COVID. You think they're just going to let you get back to normal life and live it all in freedom after this? Not a chance. They love the power, they love the control, they love being the center of attention. They're not giving this up. Now they want vaccine passports to control who can go where, when. In England, they're talking about a government vaccine certificate to go to the pub. In New York, Governor Andrew Cuomo is handing out contracts to IBM for a Big Brother health passport system. In New Jersey, Rutgers University won't let students into classes without a vaccine certificate. And now, just argued in the Wall Street Journal that we need a digital rapid detection system, integrating information from all sources, including routine reports to health authorities from medical providers, data from contact tracing databases, digital surveillance apps. Just today, the Biden administration said they're working towards developing a new nationwide vaccine passport standard. On and on it goes. A nightmare, Orwellian infrastructure of control, an unprecedented, undemocratic power grab by big business, big government, big bureaucracy. No, no, no. Here to react, author of The End of America, a letter of warning to a young patriot, Dr. Naomi Wolf. So excited that you could join us tonight. I'm just going to hand it over to you. What do you make of what we're about to see?
Thank you, Steve. I'm really happy to be here. I am not overstating this. I can't say it forcefully enough. This is literally the end of human liberty in the West if this plan unfolds as planned. Vaccine passport sounds like a fine thing if you don't understand what those platforms can do. I'm CEO of a tech company. I understand what this platform does. It's not about the vaccine. It's not about the virus. It's about your data. And once this rolls out, you don't have a choice about being part of the system. What people have to understand is that any other functionality can be loaded onto that platform with no problem at all. And what that means is it can be merged with your PayPal account, with your digital currency. Microsoft is already talking about merging it with payment plans. Your networks can be sucked up. It geolocates you everywhere you go. Your credit history can be included. All of your medical history can be included. This has already happened in Israel. Yeah. And 6 months later, we're hearing from activists that it's a two-tier society and that basically activists are ostracized and surveilled continually. It's the end of civil society, and they're trying to roll it out around the world. And it is absolutely so much more than a vaccine pass. I cannot stress enough that it has the power to turn off your life or to turn on your life, to let you engage in society or be marginalized. And by the way, the last thing I'll say, IBM has a horrible history with Nazi Germany. Its subsidiary created a kind of precursor of this with punch cards that allowed the Nazis to keep lists of, again, a two-tiered society, Aryan and Jew, in such a way that they could round up Jews, round up dissidents, round up opposition leaders very, very quickly. It's catastrophic. It cannot be allowed to continue.
Vera Sharav, a Holocaust survivor and highly respected activist in the field of medical ethics, also shared her thoughts at the Worldwide Rally for Freedom, noting the similarities between our current pandemic push toward medical tyranny and the medical abuses that occurred in early Nazi Germany.
I was 3.5 years old when my world collapsed. Nazi propaganda demonized us Jews as spreaders of disease. We were stigmatized as a menace to public health. We were forced to wear a yellow Star of David to identify us so people could throw stones or whatever. We were evicted from our home, deported, and herded into a concentration camp where my father died of typhus, which was an infectious disease that was rampant in the unsanitary, overcrowded conditions of the ghettos and concentration camps all over. It's not enough to say never again. In the 1930s, the German people succumbed to totalitarianism. If we don't fight for our freedom, we will lose it, and it will happen again. That's right. And it'll be a global Holocaust. Our survival as free human beings is on the line right now. During the Holocaust, the corporate elite profiteered from every process. Every murderous process was profitable for them. The current repressive and fearful atmosphere has, of course, brought memories, very painful memories. To live to see again the fear and to know what is possible, what is probable unless we do something, is terrible. Isolation and mandatory masks are insidious psychological weapons. They demean our dignity as human beings. Mask mandates are the symbolic equivalent of the yellow star. The real virus, my friends, is eugenics.
Yes, it is.
Eugenics is the source of the evil. That is the ideology. That is a racist, elitist ideology that sees most of us, most of humanity, as being beneath them. They regard themselves as, the Germans called it Übermenschen.
just because you're rich doesn't make you cultured. Just because you're rich doesn't make you refined. Being rich means you're rich. Some rich people are just dicks.
Eugenics and public health are very closely aligned, both in their objective and in their enforcement measures. Both rely on police or military enforcement, and both legitimize the covert objectives of the ruling class.
To kill over 10 million excess people in a year, we don't need to invest nearly what we do in military preparedness. This is something where less than $1 billion a year on R&D, medical surveillance, standby personnel, cross-training the military so they can play a role in terms of all the logistics here. This can be done. The final solution, which is a year to 2 years off, is the vaccine.
Just to head off the conspiracy theorists, maybe we shouldn't call the vaccine the final solution. Maybe just the best solution. Okay.
Eugenics leads to apartheid, forced sterilization, euthanasia, and genocide. The most important lesson of the Holocaust is how medicine can be perverted from its healing, humanitarian focus to becoming an instrument of genocide. T4 was the first mass medical murder project in history.
In case you don't know, Operation T4 was another inversion, this time of the Hippocratic Oath.
In Germany in 1939, for the first time in the history of humanity, doctors would willingly participate in the deaths of their own patients. How did this happen? Science without conscience is but the ruin of the soul, wrote Rabelais. The Nazis considered disease to be a symptom of insufficient social discipline, as well as a lack of commitment to the community. Society was portrayed as a living organism that had to be protected from parasites and cancer cells. The people's community must be pure in order to achieve the ultimate goal, which was to preserve the master race. With their slogan, "You must be healthy for the people and the state," with their obsessive emphasis on youth, health, and work, the Nazis turned illness into a crime. In the psychiatric hospitals, films were made of those patients who exhibited the most striking physical anomalies. They were deliberately presented and lit in such a way as to elicit a sense of horror in viewers. As a result of this kind of propaganda, public opinion turned against the disabled. The Third Reich needed only children that were healthy.
Everybody had to be fit, physically and mentally. There was no room for anybody else. This was not a Nazi idea. This ideology, eugenics, racial hygiene, existed long before Hitler. The eugenicists in the 1920s in particular, and even before, had already prepared the ground. The German medical profession were only waiting for Hitler so they could carry out this incredible plan. If you couldn't perform to a certain standard, if you did not perform something worthwhile for society, then you had no right to live.
In the spring of 1939, Hitler gave orders to set up a program designed to eliminate people who were considered mentally or physically disabled. This operation was to be kept absolutely secret. Hitler put his personal physician, Karl Brandt, in charge of organizing it, together with Philipp Buhler, chief of the chancellery, who in turn appointed his deputy, the Nazi official Victor Brack, to implement the plan. Brack estimated that 70,000 people would have to be eliminated. In August 1939, an administrative structure was created to oversee this operation, and it was christened the Charitable Foundation for Institutional Care. It was set up in Berlin in a villa that had been confiscated from a Jewish family. The villa's address was Tiergartenstrasse 4, hence the code name given to this extermination program, T4. The T4 officials held the first of a long series of meetings in a room in the Chancellery.
This conference is the first time in the whole of history of mankind where doctors were plotting to kill their own patients, completely against the Hippocratic Oath.
A circular sent out by the Ministry of the Interior now required maternity hospitals and pediatric wards to report children under the age of 3 with any kind of malformation or mental disorder. The succinct one-page evaluation forms were read and annotated by doctors who never saw their victims. A plus sent them to their death. A minus spared their lives. And on September 1st, 1939, Hitler started the war. The last phase of Operation T4 could now be implemented. The process of eliminating the disabled began. At the psychiatric hospital in Gurdon, as well as in other centers, children were killed first, either by injecting them with an overdose of phenobarbital or by letting them starve to death. The program was soon extended, just as covertly, to include adults. In the summer of 1941, while Jews were already being rounded up and gunned to death in Eastern Europe, the officials in charge of the final solution were looking for an industrial method of mass extermination, and in so doing, they would make use of the experience gained by the T4 crews.
Without the full support of physicians, scientists, and nurses, the Holocaust, as it unfolded, could never have happened.
The first victims of the Holocaust were German medical doctors selected children whom they deemed unworthy of life. And the children were medically murdered in accordance with doctors' orders. Now get that, how perverted. Doctors' orders. We always think of doctors' orders as being for our benefit, to heal us, but it can be turned around. The pool of victims was expanded to the mentally ill, the disabled, and then the nursing home residents. More than 300,000 German children and adults were medically murdered under T4. In 2020, officials in the wealthiest nations in the Western world, Europe, Australia, the United States, and Canada, issued orders that essentially condemned nursing home people to death.
Arrest Cuomo!
Yes.
I'm getting there.
Yes.
Before Andrew Cuomo issued his executive order on March 25th, he predicted that the virus would be like fire through dry grass. The dry grass are the human beings. His order extinguished more than 15,000 New York nursing home residents. He lied and concealed the numbers. So I guess he knew that he was responsible. Guess what the corporate media did? The Media Academy awarded him an Emmy. Awarded him an Emmy for his performances, daily briefings they called them. It was propaganda.
What am I going to do with 400 ventilators when I need 30,000? You pick the 26,000 people who are going to die. It's disrespectful of people not to wear masks. And should there be sanctions? Yes. Yes. Because it is a public health emergency, and I think there should be a penalty. Because you could literally kill someone.
Every press conference sounds like he's shaking down a pizza parlor in Bensonhurst for protection money.
It is now my distinct pleasure to present the 2020 International Emmy Founders Award to Governor Andrew Cuomo.
The end is all that we have fixed.
Somebody had a plan.
culture. It's just toxic culture, which is another, again, psychological warfare strategy where you can debase the culture through degenerate media, right? That's a classic tactic. H.G. Wells talked about doing that.
I saw you asleep beside a wall, your skull inside a ball, your eyes blackened by the sound and the thought of God. Where should I hang my head? Where would you like for me to hang my head? One absence of truth, the one horrible thing I saw, what you truly wanted to become, and who you thought I was, the fall, the frame up runs deeper than the brain, goes all the way down those tracks. Everybody bow your head for the greatest inspiration, a complete contradiction of in this hole that we have fixed, we get further and further from what we must do. I know this, I know this, you know this, you know this. Beyond this hole that we have fixed, we get further and further and further from what we must do. I saw you outside that wall, your skull outside that wall, your eyes christened by the sound and the light of God.
I can't use what I can't abuse. And I can't stop when it comes to you. You're getting me out, but I'm back at your door. Like Joan of Arc coming back from war.
It might seem easier at the moment to imagine the end of the world than to imagine the end of capitalism. But that seriously underestimates humanity's collective problem-solving abilities. We can't, however, solve complex, world-threatening problems unless we're allowed to discuss them freely. And the major social media platforms all seem determined to make sure that doesn't happen. They're acting in concert, like some monstrous mind control machine, disseminating propaganda that manipulates us ever closer toward technocratic totalitarianism, while censoring doctors, lawyers, and researchers who would expose their lies.
Propaganda, censorship, and fact-checkers control the narrative. Dissenting voices are demonized and silenced. Debate is not allowed. Why? What are they afraid of?
The truth.
The truth.
Got it.
The truth.
And it's not just big tech we're up against. There's also a strong undercurrent of fascism running through the U.S. federal government, with its omniscient intelligence agencies working in full partnership with Big Pharma, Big Media, the military-industrial complex, and all the other major corporate cartels.
It almost seems as if Adam Curtis got it right when he observed in his latest documentary, Can't Get You Out of My Head, that Hitler's Third Reich never really ended.
Horst Mahler and other radicals began to think that the problem was far deeper than just individual Nazis. That maybe the whole Nazi system had also survived and was hiding behind the facade of modern capitalism. They argued that the very system of industrial rationality and bureaucratic control that had made the Nazi state so efficient had simply mutated. It had been taken up by the victors, above all by America, and was now being used to run the new global capitalism and the multinational corporations that were ruthlessly exploiting what was called the Third World. Anything that stood in the system's way was bombed or burnt, with weapons created by the same rational industrial techniques that made the mass consumer goods. But the people in the West couldn't see this, because they had been led into a dream world that used mass consumerism and sexualized imagery to entrance and distract everyone.
Und zauberhaft schön. Die Randlosen. Strumpfhosen von...
In reality, it was an iron cage, designed to look like an open and free welfare state, a false state of peace that was built really on horror and war.
So alive in me, even just recalling it. I remember that I had gone so far and there was no turn back, that even if I had wanted to run, even if I had wanted to leave, I couldn't. It was like I was caught in something that I had no control over. I had absolutely no say-so as to what was happening there. I was just like a tool in the hands of the devil, is the only way I can put it.
Operation Paperclip is often cited as the U.S. intelligence program that brought the Nazi system to America. President Truman authorized the Paperclip program in 1946 to bring German scientists to work in America after the war, while specifying that it should exclude anyone who had been found to have been a member of the Nazi Party and more than a nominal participant in its activities. But when the War Department's Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency began conducting background checks on the scientists, they found out that all their top picks were ardent Nazis. Not wanting to send those scientists back to Germany, where they could be poached by America's enemies, the Office of Strategic Services brought the problem to the attention of their man in Switzerland, Alan Dulles, who was consulting with Dr. Carl Jung around that time and would later become the CIA's first and longest-serving civilian director.
As far as I know, we don't engage in assassinations and kidnappings and things of that kind.
Dulles teamed up with a high-ranking Nazi intelligence leader, General Reinhard Gehlen, and other like-minded individuals to scrub the scientists' dossiers of all incriminating evidence. And that's how we ended up with Werner von Braun, Roberta Struwwelder, Walter Dornberger, and all those Josef Mengele-inspired sadists who pitched in on whacked-out CIA umbrella projects like Operation Artichoke and MK Ultra. In my Crash Gordon series of novels, I suggested that the Nazi ideology of the paperclip scientists might have acted as a psychic contagion, infecting the quasi-autonomous hive mind, or egregore, of the CIA. The Germans even have a word for that sort of egregoric transmutation brought about by an ideological virus. They call it Weltanschauungskrieg, which roughly translates as worldview warfare. Correlation doesn't always equal causation, but it's interesting to note that the CIA was established when President Truman signed the National Security Act into law right after the famous wave of UFO sightings during the summer of 1947. Many of the CIA's earliest agents were recruited from the OSS, so packed full of members of the East Coast financial establishment that the acronym was jokingly said to stand for "Oh So Social." So essentially what you had with the founding of the CIA was a bunch of Nazis and Wall Street investment bankers and lawyers working together while rumors of a potential alien takeover swept the planet.
Whoa, did you see that wave?
Now, you talk about this black network. Let's follow up on this point. It's been argued that in a way, the drug money launderers, other people with the funds and money transactions, the arms merchants, they need a bank like BCCI. There is a market demand for it. Is that what you found? Well, not only did the drug dealers need a bank like this, the people moving capital flight, the people avoiding taxation, the people hiding corruption or bribery money, and intelligence agencies from both the Eastern and Western world needed this bank. I suppose if it wouldn't have been BCCI, it would have been somebody else.
I don't know about you, but whenever I learn something new about U.S. intelligence agency exploits involving bankers and lawyers hooking up with Nazis, or South American drug lords, Middle Eastern arms dealers, or billionaire child sex traffickers, I start to think about the problem of radical evil in this world. The ugly spirit, sinister forces, psychopathy, Satanism, Wetiko, demonic possession.
Like Lucifer has farted inside my brain.
Call it whatever you want.
For years, man has turned his back on the supernatural.
It's an old concept, one that predates Nazism by at least a few millennia. The Gnostics came up with the best origin story for evil, in my opinion. They believed this calamitously inverted world was created by a hostile, jealous god, known as the Demiurge, who rules it maliciously with the help of interdimensional mind parasites known as archons, who stoke our pain and mental anguish so they can psychically consume it. I know that sounds a little out there, but it can explain a lot if we're willing to take a hard look at how the world really operates. First, as a warm-up exercise, try to imagine the insane Eden that existed during the 2.5 million years of the Cretaceous period, when an estimated 2.5 billion Tyrannosaurus rexes swarmed across North America. Imagine the bloodlust of the savage god that sat in the celestial bleachers watching over such a world. Then imagine that god's minions, the archons, feasting on the psychic suffering of all the myriad creatures crushed between those billions of toothy T-Rex jaws. Now we have a starting point for what came after, when it was man's turn to play the apex predator. Man's rise to earthly dominance is a never-ending story of ecocide, rape, murder, and theft. Modern civilization has been predicated on killing our own kind and creating exploitive systems of control. Empires have always served an archontic agenda, even, or perhaps especially, the British and American empires. They maximize existential dread and suffering throughout the Demiurge's creation by violating the sovereignty of other nations and people, while taxing their own domestic populace to pay for the wars that will only benefit a parasitical few in black networks, who are willing to harm the many. Those methods of harm vary: slavery and sex trafficking, drug pushing and environmental poisoning, stripping the land of natural resources, introducing inflation-prone fiat currencies, But there's no need to get lost in the details. One example of the madness of our species should suffice. I'm thinking of the global opium trade in the 19th century and how it relates to 21st century surveillance capitalism.
We arrest drug dealers. We criminalize people, mainly black and brown people, for possessing small amounts of drugs like weed. We do this because drugs are bad. Unless, of course, it's your government that's dealing the drugs. Like that time the British Empire got China hooked on opium. Opium had been grown in China since the 11th century, but it was only until the 17th century that usage really took off, when people realized you could smoke it instead of just chewing it. By the 1800s, there were foggy back alley opium dens in the streets of Canton, now known as Guangzhou, Shanghai, and even in London's Limehouse on Pennyfield Street. In the early 19th century, Chinese exports like silk, ceramic, and tea were hugely popular in Britain. Opium was one of the few things that British Empire could trade back. It's estimated that as many as 15 million people were addicted to opium by 1890, making it one of the worst cases of national drug addiction ever seen. They would ship opium grown in colonial India to Canton, where Chinese traders would take it into China. As opium grew in popularity, British trade increased. In 1800, 300 metric tons of opium was shipped into China. 4 decades later, this had increased